have the distinct pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Mr. Aldo Leiva, Esquire, who has practiced law for over 15 years and leads the data security and privacy practice at Lubell Rosen. He is a resident of Coral Gables as well. He represents and counsels diverse clients on rapidly evolving federal, state, and international data security and privacy laws. In addition to his scientific and legal skills, Mr. Leiva has advocated for the rule of law in Cuba, serving as counsel for Cuban political prisoners and pro-democracy activists before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, resulting in a ruling against the Cuban government by an international committee for human rights violations. As a Cuba law policy analyst, Mr. Leiva has also briefed the U.S. State Department, U.S. representatives and senators, and U.S. presidential candidates on Cuban law and policy. He has also analyzed Cuba trends for trade and media organizations, the academic institutions, including FAES, American University, University of Miami, Indiana University, and St. Thomas University. And he's also a very dear friend of mine, so I'm honored to present Aldo. Welcome him today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna Maria, for that introduction. Thank you so much for being here today. Welcome to Miami for those who are from outside our area. I'd like to start with a presentation. First of all, there's been a lot of talk about what's happening with Cuba, right? Back in 2014, December of 2014 is when the Obama administration relaxed some of the restrictions on trade with Cuba. Some things that we're going to go over today are going to be, for example, what are the remaining limitations on what can be done as far as real estate investment in Cuba? And those will be viewed from two sides, right? Because there's two sides to this equation. One will be from the US side, but most importantly, from the Cuban side. As I'm an attorney, I am required to indicate to you that what I'm giving you today is just not legal advice. I'm not creating any attorney-client privileges here today, and it's purely for informational purposes here today. So what are we going to talk about today? Before we get into these questions as to what Cuba permits and what the U.S. embargo permits, we need to understand, first of all, what is Cuba property law after the revolution in 1959? That law still is in place. It is still in effect. The U.S. embargo is still in effect. You will note that despite all the changes by the Obama administration, the U.S. embargo has been codified into federal law. It's called the Helms-Burton Act, which is still in effect. So it's going to take an act of Congress to remove the embargo. Next, I'll get into the question of U.S.-Cuba policy changes of 2014. We actually just had some updates this year as well, in 2016 as well. So I'll be going into them as well. And lastly, I'll be talking about the Cuba real estate market. I put that in quotes because you'll see what some of the existing limitations are as to that. So these are pictures from this year in Havana. You'll see that over the years, the Cuban government has been unsuccessful in maintaining some of the buildings, especially in Havana itself. These are pictures that were posted this year from people that were visiting Cuba. As you can see, Cuba is ripe for at least construction, overhaul, and investment. The question is there a willingness to allow that to occur? Now, after 1959, the Castro government instituted various reforms which were in the process of converting Cuba into a Marxist-Leninist society, which it still is today. The urban reform law declared that for the first time, housing was only for people to live in, but you would not live from that. What that meant is that you couldn't be a landlord anymore, you couldn't make money off your property. You were entitled to live somewhere, you just couldn't earn revenue from property. Obviously, this caused a huge upheaval in Cuban society. Private rental was made illegal, and home sales market was destroyed by something called el derecho de tanteo, which basically inserted the Cuban government as the right of refusal to any sale of property in Cuba. Any real estate transaction, the government had the final say as to whether or not you could actually sell your property. Such authorizations, as you can imagine, were very rare. So that really brought real estate market in Cuba to a crushing halt in the early 1960s. As of 2003, all sales were illegal, although there was something called black market permutas, which were property swaps. And the way that would work is that if I was living in a house that I had grown up with, and let's say I wanted to move to your part of town, and it so happened that you wanted to move to my part of town, we would literally swap. I would move into your place, you would move into my place. No money would change hands. Basically, it was just people and furniture moving from one place to another. The fundamental law, it was in effect in Cuba from 1959 to 1976. Cuba didn't have a constitution for all those years. It was under emergency revolutionary government for those years. Finally, in 1976, the Cuban Constitution was adopted, which was basically a cut and paste of the Soviet Union's constitution, which adopted these rules formally. In 2002, the Cuban Constitution was amended one last time, basically saying that the socialist system is permanent and irrevocable. Essentially, the Constitution is now unamendable. If there's any amendment that is introduced to try to change Cuba from the socialist system, it will fail because it is illegal to do so now under their law. What does the Constitution say about private property in Cuba? Well, property ownership, it says property ownership may not be transferred to natural persons or legal entities, save for exceptional cases in which the partial or total transfer of an economic objective is carried out for the development of the country. Let me cut that down for you. Basically, if it serves the state's interests, if it serves government interests, it is permitted. Otherwise, the default is that it is not permitted. Further, such a transferal cannot affect the political, social, and economic foundations of the state prior to approval by the Council of Ministers or its Executive Committee. Council of Ministers used to be Fidel and Raul and their ministers. Now it's Raul and his ministers. The transfer of other property rights to state enterprises and other entities are authorized to fulfill this objective will be prescribed by law. So basically, Article 15 eliminated private transfers. It really placed it into the hands of the government as to whether or not it was felt to be in accordance with the goals of creating a communist system in Cuba. Article 15 also authorized and made legal expropriation. As of that moment, it declared that all property belongs to the state, including the sugar mills, the factories, chief means of transportation, and all those enterprises, banks, and facilities that have been nationalized and expropriated from the imperialist, landholders, and bourgeoisie. That's classic Soviet language there that they dutifully imported there. So basically, it meant that all property in Cuba belongs to the state, not to private individuals. That remains the law today. Now, in response to these expropriations, the U.S. embargo was instituted in 1960 by the Kennedy administration. Actually, it was first enacted by Eisenhower and then put into place by Kennedy. It was imposed on exports to Cuba after Cuba nationalized American-owned properties without compensation. One thing to add here is that expropriation does occur and can occur. In the United States law, there's something called eminent domain. If the government decides that it wants to build a road through the Biltmore Hotel, they have a right to do so. However, they would have to go through a legal process by which they would have to get a ruling of law and also pay the owners of the hotel fair market value for the loss of their property. What happened in Cuba is that the Cuban government was just seizing properties without paying anything for them. And that has implications for us today still. One thing I want to clarify, the Cuban government refers to it as a bloqueo, which is the blockade. The U.S. is not blocking Cuba's trade with third parties, and actually blockade is a military term. It suggests that there's U.S. Navy vessels around Cuba today. That's not the case. The embargo, as I said before, was codified into federal law in the United States in 1992 as the Cuba Democracy Act. And basically it says that there's a condition under which you can lift the embargo, and it will be lifted if democratic multi-party elections are held and free market is adopted. We are not there yet, so therefore the embargo still is in place and still remains U.S. law today. Another side effect of the expropriations by the Cuban government in the early 60s was that there was a registration of claims for expropriated property. I want to differentiate. These are claims by U.S. companies, okay? U.S. companies and individuals that owned property in Cuba pre-1959. These are not claims by Cubans forced into exile. The value of those is $1.9 billion of the current fair market value of what those claims are worth for utilities, sugar mills, ranches, corporate holdings, and property. These are all certified by something called the U.S. Foreign Claims Settlement Commission, which is part of the U.S. Department of Justice. All these companies back in the 1960s had a certain period of time within which to file their claims. So long as they filed their claims back then, those claims will be honored with any future negotiations with Cuba. And there's about 5,913 claims at present. The time to file claims, by the way, has closed off. So if anybody had any property expropriated, you're out of luck. Cuba's foreign debt. Cuba also received a lot of foreign debt over the years from its former partners in during the Cold War, USSR, China, et cetera. They are in default of all their external financing obligations for over 50 years. In other words, they borrow money, they just don't pay it back. Official foreign debt is $12.3 billion, and the Club of Paris, which is the 19 major creditors of Cuba, including Russia and Brazil, claim that there's an additional $30.5 billion that are due and owing. So Cuba, the government, which owns all the property in Cuba, also owns a lot of money to a lot of foreign creditors. There's also civil claims against the Cuban government at present. Now, these arose out of U.S. lawsuits that were filed here in the United States against the Cuban government. Approximately $4 billion in unpaid judgments have been entered against Cuba for executions, torture, and acts of terror. Cuba was designated as a state sponsor of terrorism from 1982 until May 2015. The amount of damages that are actually collectible now against Cuba are $2.1 billion in compensatory damages and $1.8 billion punitive damages. And yes, this is all subject to interest. So you can see there's a lot of people interested in recovering money from the Cuban government, so that's a potential issue for anyone willing to invest in Cuba. These are some examples of some of the claims. Aldo Vera Jr. versus Republic of Cuba. They said that judgments for certain acts of the Cuban government can be enforced against Cuban state assets that are blocked in U.S. banks. And in fact, we've had some instances where Cuban assets that were locked in U.S. banks going back to the 1960s were actually unfrozen and allowed to go to satisfy some of these claims. An Argentinian bank was also ordered to comply with a subpoena in connection with Vera's attempt to enforce his $49 million judgment. So these kinds of loose ends, these kinds of outstanding claims are something you need to understand within the general milieu of Cuba's market. Now, the Cuban government is well aware of all the creditors and all the attempts to collect funds from them, and they've had to adopt certain strategies to try to avoid these kinds of situations. As stated before, U.S. courts may impound Cuban aircraft to satisfy multi-million-dollar judgments against the Cuban government. So that creates a real problem for Cuban aviation. Any jet that Cuba owns that lands at Miami International Airport tomorrow can technically be impounded and sold off to satisfy a judgment. The Cuban government owns all planes in Cuba. But what it may do is may attempt to lease U.S.-owned planes to operate flights to the U.S. That's why most of the traffic now is not Cubana Airlines or Aviación Cubana. It's basically American Airlines and other U.S. companies that are not subject to collection. Cuba has been pushing for sovereign immunity to prevent enforcement of judgments. Basically, that's a rule of law that basically says that governments can seek exemption from having to pay these kinds of obligations. So far, they've been unsuccessful in doing so. So what happened on December 17th of 2014? That's when, after all these many years of the embargo in effect taking place, the Obama administration modified and revised some of the possibilities under the embargo. The embargo still remains in effect. Most transactions, including real estate transactions, are prohibited. So basically, any trade between U.S. and Cuba is still largely outlawed and not permitted under the embargo. Tourist travel is still prohibited under the current regulations. Now, you hear a lot about travel to Cuba. The travel to Cuba from the United States, at least now, is only through special licenses. And so if you wanted to travel to Cuba as a U.S. citizen, you would need to basically go in and designate yourself as to one of the various exemptions that would allow you to travel to Cuba. For example, if you're going to go visit relatives, or if you are going as part of a church group that's going, a religious group, an educational group, some research, etc. The Cuba Democracy Act, which I mentioned before, still remains in place, and these are some of the changes, though, that have been instituted via administrative action. So, what's permitted? As I said before, some licensed travel, family visits, official U.S. government business. Journalists can travel to and from Cuba. Professional research and meetings, educational activities, and religious activities. Also for performances and exhibitions, I'm sure you've heard the Rolling Stones just played in Cuba recently, so they're trying to open up and attract more international large groups to start playing there. Support for the Cuban people, basically humanitarian trips to Cuba. Private foundation research, export, import, or transmission of information materials, basically magazines, articles, anything relating to information exchange. It has been expanded, and certain authorized export transactions, such as, for example, right now, you can send farming and agricultural equipment to Cuba from the United States. And in fact, they've also just, as of October 17th, they authorized it to be done on credit for the first time. So that's been lifted from one of the restrictions. Now, the Cuban government can buy agricultural equipment from John Deere or any other U.S. manufacturers on credit. Also reestablished embassies in both countries. The U.S. interest section was changed into the U.S. Embassy in Havana. The Cuban interest section in Washington, D.C. was changed into the Cuban Embassy. Cuba, as I said before, was removed from the state sponsor of terror list from the State Department, and the focus of the administration's policy decision was to focus on technology transfer to Cuba. The hope was being that you could foster some kind of more openness in Cuba by allowing access to technology and so on and so forth. And also, part of the deal was that 5 Cuban spies were released from U.S. prisons, and they were able to make it back to Cuba. So those were the terms of the deal. In 2015, the White House also further modified and expanded upon these. They allowed limited physical presence for news bureaus, for exporters of authorized goods, as I said before, mostly agricultural or construction, for privately owned buildings, mail, parcel, and cargo transportation. So, for example, companies like FedEx have been able to further be involved in Cuba. Telecom, internet, education, religious, travel, and carrier services. So now these different sectors can have physical offices, physical locations in Cuba. From the U.S. side, it's authorized. It's still up to the Cuban side, Cuban government, to decide whether or not they'll permit these groups to really set up and start operating there. Commercial and financial transactions, U.S. persons may provide goods and services to individual Cuban nationals located outside of Cuba, provided there is no commercial exportation of goods or services to or from Cuba. So, case in point, if there's a Cuban company that's in Mexico, there may be some limited circumstances under which a U.S. person may be able to do business with them, so long as there's no exportation of anything back to the island itself. March 2016, there were additional revisions. Non-immigrant Cuban nationals in the U.S., such as athletes and artists, may receive salary or compensation, provided that the recipient is not subject to special tax assessments in Cuba and no additional payments are made to the Cuban government. So theoretically, this allows musicians and athletes to come here so long as they don't pay their taxes back in Cuba. Physical presence was authorized for entities involved in authorized humanitarian projects or non-commercial activities, and also private foundations and research educational institutes. So really, we're just seeing just the start of very small steps that have been taken from the U.S. side. Just a couple of weeks ago, the Obama administration further modified its revisions. It now allows for certain health-related transactions. For example, it's going to allow for FDA approval of Cuban pharmaceuticals. That is, if Cuba has certain pharmaceuticals that it wants to introduce into the U.S. market, the FDA for the first time has the authority to assess them and decide whether or not to allow them to enter the U.S. market. Humanitarian-related transactions have been further liberalized, as have certain travel-related transactions. With all the increase in flights to and from Cuba, the Obama administration has decided to expand safety consulting for civil safety consulting businesses. So, for example, if they want to advise on how to safely store aircraft or further expand or improve upon existing aircraft fleet in Cuba, that's now permitted under the latest revisions that came into effect October 17th. So here's something very interesting. Trade and commerce in general. For the first time, they've introduced something called contingent contracts. So the idea of a contingent contract is as follows. It says that if I want to engage in a transaction with the Cuban government that would be legal if the embargo were lifted 6 months from now or a year from now, I could start negotiating and even sign a contract with Cuba, which would be contingent on the embargo being lifted. That's at least trying to create some kind of pressure to see if the embargo would be lifted on that side, but these contracts are now legal. I've not yet heard of any that have been signed yet. Real estate, above all, which is why you're all here, real estate has not been addressed at all by any of these transactions, okay? There's been no specific, on the U.S. side, there's been no U.S. liberalization that speaks specifically to real estate transactions. Now, what's happened with Cuba since the lifting of these regulations, actually, surprisingly, there's been a drop-off in U.S. trade in goods with Cuba, according to the U.S. Census. So between 2010 and 2016, and mind you, the policy changed in 2014, you actually had a further dip in trade with Cuba. As you all know, being an international audience, for years, Cuba has been trading freely with the rest of the world and has received a lot of its materials and food and supplies from Canada, Latin America, Europe, basically the rest of the world. So U.S. is not becoming an increasing player according to the U.S. Census as far as the trade, the value of trade. U.S. Coast Guard migrant interdictions have gone up. Ironically, the idea of change coming to Cuba has not been accepted by the Cuban population, so we have even more Cubans abandoning the island and coming here to the United States, deciding that these limited market changes are not sufficient assurance to remain in Cuba and hope for change. So what are Cuban property rights? What do you own in Cuba as a property owner? I told you before, the Cuban government owns every bit of property in Cuba. A Cuban purchaser of a home owns only the physical structure on the lot and not the land on which the structure is built. So if I buy your house, I'm literally buying your house. I'm not buying the land that your house stands upon. So I'm just buying the brick and the mortar and the roof. That's it. The government retains all title to the land. So basically, title transfers are not allowed under Cuban law we're talking about. Mortgaging your home is not legal. Why? Because that would allow someone to make money off of your property. So that would violate Cuban constitutional law as well. Law 288 was enacted in 2011, authorizing for the first time the sales of homes, but there were some tight restrictions on that. Only Cuban citizens and permanent residents can buy and sell real property, okay? So the idea of coming in there and buying from a Cuban national, that's illegal under Cuban law. The prices are not based on any kind of publicly available information. It's basically set on negotiation, transaction by transaction, person amongst person. There's no place where you can look up comps in Cuba. Also, what can you own as a Cuban citizen? You're limited to your one main residence and one vacation home. I can assure you that there's very few Cubans with vacation homes on the island. According to Cuban government figures, 45,000 homes exchanged hands in 2012. That was a year after the law was passed, and that's in a country of 15.6 million people. So there's still very little movement as far as a domestic Cuban-based real estate market because of all these restrictions. Transactions must occur through a state-owned bank, and the buyer pays with a cashier's check. The Cuban government is also involved in all these transactions. Now, real estate agents were illegal in Cuba until 2013. So now you can allow for real estate agents. They're called corredores, and they can charge broker fees of only up to 7 to 10%. Private real estate lawyers, there's no such thing. You have to use a notario, which basically is a civil notary, which would basically be there to record the transaction and provide the requisite documentation for it. The Cuban government in these types of transactions makes money from both participants in the transaction. The seller has to pay a 4% tax to the government, and the buyer has to pay a 4% tax to the government. Foreign participation in the market. So, it should be abundantly clear to you now, foreigners and Cubans living abroad cannot buy property in Cuba pursuant to Cuban law. Now, there are some exceptions because we've been down this road before with Cuba. Cuba has previously authorized limited foreign investment in certain situations. For example, there's some towers in Havana which were built to be sold to foreigners. Those still remain available for foreign sales. Mostly Europeans and Latin Americans have owned those units, but those are very few and far between. Another issue with foreign participation in the market is that claims by exiled Cubans can create title issues. So let's say that tomorrow the Cuban government decided that it was going to allow foreign investment in, let's say, a building, and that, so U.S. companies can go in there, they can start buying a property, or foreign companies can also come in and start buying a property. Your title searches and your title you better get some good title insurance, because odds are that there's going to be an expropriation claim somewhere in there for any property that was unlawfully taken away by the Cuban government in the 1960s. The Cuban government has previously liberalized home sales only to reverse course. This was done back in the 1990s during the special period when they lost the subsidies from the Soviet Union, and then they reversed course once they received subsidies from Venezuela. So here we are again. What's the likelihood of Cuba investment in U.S. or Miami? So there actually is a lot of, there's a large population of Cuban emigration to Tampa, and these folks are closer with the Cuban government. Many of them do a lot of travel back and forth to Cuba now. The question then becomes, can these individuals participate in the U.S. market, assuming they have the wherewithal to do it? First of all, the Cuban government cannot formally engage in these kinds of transactions because of the U.S. embargo and because of the likelihood of claims being asserted to try to collect the value of any of those claims. Most with disposable income may be blocked under the embargo. Those would be government officials, so that's not going to happen. The Cuban refugees and migrants who are arriving, most if not all arrivals will be unable to invest, and most recent arrivals will live with family or rent. So there's no appreciable participation, at least formally, by the Cuban government. That's going to be illegal still. U.S. investment in Cuba, as I said before, foreign purchase of property is illegal unless it's in a joint venture with the Cuban government. These joint ventures require by law that the Cuban government be the majority owner, so therefore they can decide what to do with your money once you invested it in there. It's also restricted under the Trading with the Enemy Act. What about Cuban Americans? There's been a lot of talk about that. Cuban Americans can send $8,000 a year to relatives. They can transport up to $10,000 each time they travel to Cuba. Cuban American purchase of property in Cuba would be construed as violation of both Cuban and U.S. law. So I've been hearing stories of people, for example, buying property through a third party. Again, that's going to be illegal under both U.S. and Cuba law. What's the potential impact on Miami's commercial real estate market? As of 2016, U.S. was still the fourth largest exporter of goods to Cuba, despite dipping down in its relative importance. Agriculture, healthcare, and construction materials for private use are really what's going to be of demand on the island, but the Cuba export market is still very limited. One example of that, the head of the Florida Chamber of Commerce was asked questions about this, saying that, now that there's more possibilities with Cuba, aren't you excited about this being an opportunity for the United States? And they said, Cuba presents to us a market just as robust as Haiti. It's a third world country that is very poor, and there's no market there to be able to even buy U.S. products. And that's really been the reality of this. Technology, which was one of the issues that was one of the policy goals of the Obama administration, the plan was to try to connect Cuba to the internet. Right now, the connectivity of Cuba to the internet is at between 6 and 8%. So 6 to 8% of Cubans have access to the internet right now. The majority of those who do it through government authorized access to the internet. So there's no way you can go online and communicate efficiently now. So very far behind. Google went to Cuba and made them an offer. They said, we can put wireless access in every Cuban home, in every Cuban city. We have the technology to do it, we're willing to do it, and we'll do it for free. The Cuban Department of the Interior said, thank you for your kind offer, we're not interested. Okay? It's open technology and open access is something that a dictatorship has a hard time with. What are the options for South Florida region as far as industrial space? We've got a lot of space here that was built in anticipation of the Panama Canal opening or expanding. So a lot of that export market is already occupied. I'll open it now to questions, but basically, this is Halloween, so I couldn't bear the irony of saying I haven't tried to scare you too much, but I just want you to understand that any talk of realistic investment in Cuba is still a lot remains to be seen as to whether or not it's going to be possible. Forget about the U.S. embargo. If it's lifted tomorrow, there's substantial roadblocks from the Cuban side that will limit that. And quite honestly, I think that this latest openness on the Cuban side is a necessary evil they've had to adopt, but I don't think the Cuban government is willing to open up much further. The Cuban envoy to Canada was quoted last year in regard to all these changes, and he basically said, this does not mean that Cuba is opening up to foreign investment in real estate. The Cuban government for now will own all Cuban property for the benefit of Cubans. So that's really their policy as it stands today. With that, I want to thank you for your attention and your time. They've expanded it. So long as you have a license and you account for that money, you can do that. That's been more liberalization during this humanitarian people-to-people movements. They have to give it to the person who they designated the license for. Yeah, I can't just go in with $10,000 and try to buy a bodega or something. I have to give it to, Uncle Carlos. Yeah. Although they've lifted the limitations on cigars and rum, so you can get as much as you want. Yes, they tax every dollar, every penny that goes into Cuba is taxed by the Cuban government. Yes, I mean, the Department of Treasury is the department that's in charge of enforcing this, and they have something called OFAC, which is the Office of Foreign Asset Controls. That's the department that prints all these updates as to what's happening with the embargo, and that's who would prosecute with the U.S. Attorney General's office any violators of this. And they have done it with regard to, for example, foreign banks that have been found trading with Cuba, especially in France and in Europe as well. So yes, there's an enforcement mechanism there. The question is willingness to do so. That's it from me. Thank you.